We got so much to cover here. So we're going to be covering some recent changes in the Medicare set-aside space, specifically what happened around Section 111 reporting mandates of Medicare set-aside data for Section 111 reporting. And oh my gosh, that's such a mouthful, but don't worry, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty details. But first, I'm going to talk about, the way I like to uh, uh, sequence these educational talks is to start at a really high level and then dig down. I know some folks go right into it, and for individuals who don't really have a background or maybe know some of the concepts but don't really have a good grounding in this, I think it's best to start at the with the real basics and then get into the nitty gritty of the details. So we're going to talk about very simplistically why we're here. We're going to talk about Medicare coverage basics, and then some important Medicare secondary payer foundational concepts like coordination of benefits and what conditional payments are and recovery, just so you have an idea of how this stuff kind of works in Section 111 primer. And then we're going to get into our Medicare set-aside focus and updates around this new world of Medicare set-aside compliance. So you can go to the next slide. So why on earth are we here? We are here due to the convergence of really three things that are a big deal within our realm. First is Medicare, individuals who happen to be Medicare beneficiaries. And the second is workers' compensation, which we all know and love and understand. And the third is a unique set of federal laws, regulations, policy, and all of these things sort of converge in this Venn diagram to make up Medicare secondary payer. So it's really the convergence of Medicare, work comp, and federal law. And there's really nothing else like this in our space where we see the convergence of these three things. So that's why we're here. And you can go to the next slide. Now, before we get into some of the more advanced concepts, we'll go back just one slide. I think we went one slide too quick, if you don't mind. Perfect. So Medicare is federal health care for certain individuals who've reached a certain birthday. The magic number is 65 years of age or older. And way back in 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Social Security amendments and created Medicare, which is federal health care coverage for certain individuals who are 65 or who have certain disabilities. And there's two primary parts to traditional or original Medicare. Part A is hospital treatment, inpatient, and Part B is outpatient medical treatment. By and large, most folks are entitled to Medicare because they reach that magic birthday of 65 years of age. 88%, in fact, are entitled to Medicare because of that. But we're in the workers' compensation realm, and we see individuals who have had injuries on the job, work-related injuries, and they can become disabled. So a small segment of them, 12% approximately, become entitled to Medicare because they receive 24 consecutive months plus a waiting period for Social Security disability. Many long-term disability plans require individuals to apply for SSDI if they've been disabled for a certain period of time. There's a couple other narrow disability areas: end-stage renal disease. If you're on dialysis, you can be entitled to Medicare, and ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. But I guess the takeaway here is don't discount the fact that someone could be entitled to Medicare just because they're not 65 years of age or older. This is why determining Medicare enrollment is so critical. You could have someone in their 30s or their 40s who have enough qualifying work orders be entitled to Medicare because of a disability. I'm not going to get into Part C and D. Just know Part C is Medicare Advantage, administered by private plans, and Part D has to do with prescription drugs. But our focus really is going to be on traditional Medicare Part A and B. There will be some sprinklings of Part C and D in there as we talk about this stuff. Some takeaways I have here, a couple links. Please don't mistake Medicaid. If you're out in California, each state brands it different. California's Medi-Cal. Certain states, like where I hail from, Massachusetts, is Mass Health. Each state brands it differently, but Medicaid is totally different. Don't confuse that. Just remember, an individual can be entitled to Medicare under 65 due to a disability. You can go to the next slide, please. So we have the Medicare program was doing just fine from way back in 1965 to 1980, and it was moving along, but Congress started looking at the fact that Medicare was paying out more than it was taking in relative to revenues, and that was a problem. So what was the reason for that? Well, people were living a lot longer. Back in 1965, 65 years of age was considered old age, and now 65 year spring chicken. That's the new 30 or 40. Medical science was advancing. People were taking better care of themselves. So Congress started looking at the viability, the long-term viability of the Medicare program, and they were going, gosh, we're going to run out of money. There was another reason they were looking at it, because they found, after Congress had a study conducted by the Office of the Inspector General, that Medicare was paying for claims that should have been the responsibility of an underlying workers' compensation carrier or liability or auto or no fault insurer. So what happened when Congress started looking at that and going, oh my gosh, we're not taking in enough revenues to pay out for future beneficiaries for the Medicare program? What do we do with respect to the fact that Medicare is paying up and down for healthcare treatment for bodily injury claims that a comp carrier should have paid? Congress does what they do best. They legislate. So you keep going. And so on December 5th of 1980, that's a very magic number, the Medicare Secondary Payer Act was signed into law. And effectively what that is federal legislation that ensures that Medicare is going to be the payer of last resort. If there's any insurance, health plan, workers' compensation plan, it's even applicable to group health insurance, though I'm only going to be keeping this in the work comp realm. Auto, no fault, medical payments, personal injury protection, any type of health plan that could pay for a bodily injury claim. Medicare, via the Medicare Secondary Payer Act, wanted to ensure that it is the payer of last resort and it's placed in a secondary payer situation. So the whole goal behind the MSP Act is to ensure that Medicare doesn't pay when another responsible insurance carrier should. Those responsible insurance carriers are known as primary payers. So when you hear me say primary payer, just think workers' compensation payer. Could include a self-insured, could include an insurance carrier too. You can keep going, please. The whole thrust behind Medicare Secondary Payer is the preservation of the Medicare Trust Fund. It's to prevent a cost shift over to the Medicare program when other primary payers should be paying. It may not seem like a big deal, with respect to this huge behemoth healthcare program, but think of the millions and millions of people every year who are involved in workers' compensation accidents, who have group health plan and coverage, who are out there going to treat when Medicare should be paying, who get in automobile accidents, etc. So it's really a mechanism to ensure that Medicare is going to be a viable program for years and years to come. So our kids and our grandkids have Medicare coverage. And keep going, please. The how. So there's three primary components to Medicare Secondary Payer. And one in particular that we talk about the most, MSA, is actually a creature of policy. The first goes in line with what the Medicare Secondary Payer statute says. It's like, hey, we're not going to pay if there's another primary payer who's responsible to pay. But if that primary payer, or if Medicare rather, happens to make a payment, Medicare always makes payment on the condition that it's reimbursed should responsibility be demonstrated. And in workers' compensation, responsibility is demonstrated just by virtue of an accident or an injury within the course of employment. and having an accepted claim. We talk about ongoing responsibility for medicals being assumed. That sort of bleeds into Section 111. But think of conditional payments as during the pendency of a claim. If Medicare makes a payment, they get to get their money back. Has nothing to do with MSAs. It's totally separate from Medicare set-asides, and totally separate from Section 111. It's an independent right of recovery that Medicare has. Now we move on to Section 111. And it's important, Section 111, for a variety of reasons, because it's going to come back to us when we talk about these changes that happen with Medicare set-asides. So Section 111 came in 2007 with an amendment to the Medicare secondary payer statute. And you can go back one slide to 11. Perfect. And what happened before Section 111 is you'd literally call up Medicare on the phone and say, hey, I have John or Jane Doe. They hurt themselves in a work comp accident. I'd like to report a claim. Make sure you don't make any payment. Here are the ICD codes that are related to the injury. Here's the date of loss or incident. And if you make a payment, here's the insurance carrier you can go back to. Had nothing to do with MSAs. And it was really, really hit or miss. Medicare had no way of systematically knowing if they should make a payment or not, i.e. coordination of benefits, or if they had an opportunity to recover, or if there was a Medicare set-aside done on the case. All it was it kind of, hey, please call us up and do something. So Medicare put an end to that. Medicare said, we're going to put the onus on insurance carriers and self-insureds, these primary payers, and in the parlance, we call them responsible reporting entities, and we're going to mandate that they report over certain data associated with bodily injury claims. What's really important here to know is if Section 111 didn't exist, Medicare wouldn't really have a systematic way of knowing on a claim-by-claim basis if there was a secondary payer situation. What's very interesting about this is for the longest time, it was really only used to coordinate benefits, meaning when Medicare should or shouldn't pay, and to seek recovery of conditional payments made. However, as of April 4th of this past year, now Medicare is going to know about the existence of a Medicare set-aside in a workers' compensation claim if one was incorporated. We'll kind of put a pin in that, and we're going to talk about that later on. You can go to slide 12, please. Okay, so there's three primary components. Lots of stuff in Medicare secondary payer comes in three, but there's three primary components to Section 111 reporting. And I'm going to talk in workers' compensation here. So the first is the query process. This is just a procedure for responsible reporting entities or primary payers to determine if an individual claimant is in fact entitled to Medicare. So it allows them to submit over the injured individual's first name, their last name, their date of birth, their social, and their gender to determine on a monthly basis with an open claim if this person's entitled to Medicare. And if the person's not entitled, then they keep querying until the claim is closed or completely resolved. If they happen to be entitled to Medicare, then the RRE and their reporting agent get certain information back from Medicare, such as do they have a Part C Medicare Advantage coverage? What's the effective date for coverage? Do they have a Part D prescription drug coverage as well? Query is really the first step in the process just to determine at a threshold, are we even dealing with a Medicare beneficiary? The next is ORM, or ongoing responsibility for medicals. This has to do with an insurance carrier or self-insured's assumption of ORM. So think an accepted claim. When a claim's accepted, and if a bill would come in and the carrier would pay it because they've made a claim determination that this is a compensable claim, they would effectively have assumed ongoing responsibility to Medicare. It's the insurance carrier or self-insured waving to Medicare, ORM, hey, we're out here as a primary payer. Medicare, please don't make any payment associated with the related injuries, related industrial injuries. We're going to make a payment. So it's a coordination of benefits function. It also lets Medicare know, hey, if you do happen to make a payment, we are the entity out here because we've assumed ORM that you can come back to. And Medicare does this via contractors that they have. Okay, and then lastly is TPOC, or total payment obligation to claimant, a really important one. TPOC's just a fancy way of saying settlement. It signals to Medicare that there's finality to the claim, and usually it's in conjunction with ORM termination. And what's really interesting about this, it's going to come back, we're going to talk about it in a little bit here, is now with TPOC, RREs are required to report over Medicare set-aside information with TPOC events. So more on that. We're going to put a quick pin in that. We'll move to the next slide here, please. Okay, we can keep going. So we're going to focus now on Medicare set-asides. We're going to get a little bit more technical here. So why are there Medicare set-asides? A lot of folks don't know about this. There is a single regulation. So super brief civics lesson. So you have the US Constitution as your base. You have federal statutory law. You have regulations or agency or / administrative rules that get issued, the fancy words promulgated. Then you have policy on top of that. And then you have case law off to this side that determines whether or not any of those rules, regulations comport with the Constitution or federal law. And I'm just talking federal law. There's a whole hierarchy like that to state law too. But there's a single Medicare secondary payer administrative rule that got issued back in 1989 that speaks to, in workers' compensation specifically, when there's a full and final settlement in a compensable claim, so think a CNR, that Medicare in those instances doesn't pay for medical expenses if the applicant was compensated for their future medicals until the applicant spends down all of their settlement money on Medicare covered meds. My goodness, there's a regulation that says that? Yes, it's a Medicare secondary payer regulation. What's it have to do with MSAs? It has every single thing to do with MSAs. And when we go to the next slide, I'll tell you why. In the late 1990s, oh, you can go back one more, sorry, to 15. Perfect. In the late 90s, some folks started looking at this regulation. And if you want to look it up, it's found at 42 CFR, which stands for Code of Federal Regulations, 411.46. And in the late 90s, some people were looking at this reg and said, I think there's something here. What can we do about this? Having a mandatory spend down requirement for applicants to spend down their entire settlement on Medicare covered meds until Medicare kicks in seems pretty harsh. So what if, in the spirit of this regulation, effectively as a compromise, we make a determination of what the applicant's going to need, and we set aside money from the settlement in consideration of Medicare's interests to pay for Medicare covered medical expenses after the settlement. Okay, great. So parties started doing this and judges started approving these settlements within the spirit of this reg. And CMS is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They ended up blessing this process in 2001 with the issuance of what we refer to as the Patel memo. A gentleman, a CMS administrator named Prashar B. Patel, issued this memo in July 2021 or in July 2001, and a dozen or so memos issued after that, and then Medicare issued the workers' compensation Medicare set-aside reference guide, the workers' compensation review contractor, the contractor that reviews voluntary submissions was introduced well before that, the WCMSA reference guide, and then a quarter of a century later, here we are. Basically, this one single regulation spawned an entire compliance requirement across the United States with respect to workers' compensation settlements and created a cottage industry. And here we are, but it's entirely policy-based, based upon this single regulation. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, what is an MSA? It's simply an estimation of anticipated lifetime Medicare covered meds that an individual is going to need related to their underlying industrial injury for the rest of their life. It's a best guesstimate based upon the claim file and medical records and payment history, and treatment records. You can go to the next slide. The purpose of the Medicare set-aside is to protect Medicare's interest by doing the best we can to prevent a cost shift over to the Medicare program. We talk about this all the time in this industry. You know, what's the fear? The fear is that the applicant gets compensated by way of a CNR, and then they go buy a boat, or they go to Vegas and put it all on red. And what happens after that effectively is the taxpayers are burdened by having to pay for medical expenses for which an injured Medicare beneficiary was compensated for, i.e. they received what we refer to in MSP as a primary payment. So the purpose of this is to prevent the Medicare program from being burdened by this. Within the spirit of 42 CFR 41146, which is a spend down requirement, it says, hey, here's a better way. How about we just make an estimation of what this person needs and we set the money aside from the settlement. So while it's true that if you look in the Medicare secondary payer statute, you're not going to see the words Medicare set aside. Even if you look through that reg that I rattled off, you're not going to see MSA. But Medicare, the only sanctioned vehicle that they've told us that takes Medicare's interest into account is by going through the process of doing an MSA. And we'll take a closer look at that on the next slide, please. So what does CMS say? This is Medicare's words. This isn't mine. So when do you do one of these? CMS says on their WCMSA website, all parties in a work comp case have significant responsibilities under the Medicare secondary payer laws to protect Medicare's interest when resolving cases that include future medical expenses. The recommended method, nay, the only method that they've ever said we can do to protect their interests, is a WCMSA. That stands for Workers' Compensation Medicare Set-Aside. So thanks a lot, Shawn. That's super broad. Do you have anything more specific? Why, yes, I do. Right on the next slide. Okay, so anytime future medicals are implicated. Now, these are the questions I ask if you're going through if you want a checklist and you want to take this and print it out and keep it on your desk. Is there going to be a full and final settlement that relieves the underlying work comp payer of obligations for ongoing responsibility of medicals? If the answer is yes, then you're probably going to want to look into an MSA. If it's a STIP only, where it's just indemnity, and the work comp carrier or self-insured is maintaining responsibility post settlement, then you wouldn't do an MSA because the comp carrier maintains primary payer responsibility. So let's say you're resolving medical expenses, great, by way of CNR. No, I also look at the settlement amount. Is the settlement amount $1,000? Or is the settlement amount a significant amount of money? You know, you're starting to get into the $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $25,000 threshold. We'll talk about the thresholds in a little bit. Is any aspect of that claim remaining open? Maybe you're just settling out one body part, but another body part's remaining open. Certain judges will look at, and certain jurisdictions will look at the settlement and make requirements with respect to MSAs as well. I also look at the injured party status. What's their Medicare status? Are they imminent? Are they 62 and a half years of age or older when we get into this reasonable expectation of Medicare enrollment? Are they 63, 64, 65 years of age or older? Or are they 19 years old and don't have enough qualifying work orders to get on Medicare? Do they have documentation status where they're not going to ever be able to be on Medicare because of their citizenship status? Do they possess some sort of disability? Have they applied for Social Security disability insurance? Have they applied and they've been denied, but they're going to appeal it, etc.? What's the claim status? Is it a completely accepted compensable claim, or is it denied, or are there components of it that are denied? That could lend itself. If it's completely denied and settling on a completely disputed basis, we're talking about zero Medicare set-asides that we're going to talk about later. And there's been some rule changes with respect to voluntarily submitting those. What's the need for future treatment? Does the person have a lengthy claim file with documented healthcare treatment necessitating future treatment, or are they at MMI and everything is pretty much resolved? And did the physician write a letter saying they're never going to need Medicare covered treatment ever again? What's the severity of their injuries? And then lastly, and I think this is really the dispositive question, is there going to be a cost shift to the Medicare program post-settlement? That's really, at the end of the day, the litmus test for whether or not to do a Medicare set-aside. If there's going to be a cost shift, you want to make sure you mitigate against that by doing a Medicare set-aside. We can move to slide 20, please. So what's the MSA? I think many people have seen these before, but just to go through it for the newbies here, the MSA is the report. It's a projection, projected allocation of what we think anticipated post-settlement or future Medicare-covered healthcare treatment could include items, durable medical equipment, prescription drugs that are associated with the underlying injuries related to the workers' compensation claim. And how we do that is we look at the last or the latest, i.e. most recent 2 years of medical records, associated pay histories, applicable claim file records, any associated legal documents that might be a driving force behind this. And then we make a determination, just a line item determination based upon CMS's guidelines around what this individual is going to require post-settlement. Next slide, please. So we have the allocation. Now we have funding options, and this is where things start getting interesting. So Medicare tells us that a Medicare set-aside can be funded lump sum, meaning they get all the money up front, or it can be funded via an annuity, which is purchased through a structured settlement broker who goes to a life company, who shops around for the best deal, and funds the MSA with an upfront, what they refer to as a seed amount, which is the first couple years of expenses and procedures. And then there's an annual funding date that's established, and each year they get a set sum of money that provides them with a steady stream of income with respect to that MSA. Now, most MSAs I see done are funded via annuity, and I think an annuity, I'm not here to sell you on annuities, but I think there's tremendous benefit there. Typically, the carrier or the work comp payer saves money up front, and they're able to purchase this annuity at present day value, and it'll pay out the total amount of that MSA, but they're able to buy it at a cheaper amount. The second thing I've seen that it can do is there is a terrible amount of temptation when an individual applicant is compensated by way of an MSA. Average MSA, if you're looking at a workers' compensation review contractor figures, I believe it's around $73,500. That's a lot of money for someone to have upfront. And I think there's some temptation there to take it and go to Anaheim and go to Disneyland, or go on a cruise or something like that. And Medicare, I can promise you, does not pay for trips to Disneyland or cruises. So there's a risk, I think, of funding this thing upfront via a lump sum. But these are the options I wanted to articulate here that parties have to fund these. So that's funding. And then on the next slide, I believe we're going to talk about administration. So there are requirements that Medicare outlines that when an MSA is incorporated, so there's been a CNR, the MSA is funded, let's say it's funded via an annuity, what does the applicant do with the initial seed amount for the MSA? First thing they have to do, they have to place it in an interest-bearing checking account separate from their running checking account. So they can't have the funds commingled with their checking, and that sort of makes sense. You don't want someone paying rent or their mortgage or a car payment or buying groceries and trying to keep track of healthcare transactions on top of that. So separate interest-bearing account that they can write checks from. There's record-keeping requirements. They have to keep requirements of every single transaction and payment they make with respect to that MSA over to healthcare providers or pharmacy, etc. They can only, the most important thing here is use that account with their Medicare set aside for Medicare covered expenses related to the purpose of that MSA. So they can't take the MSA and go to the ER and get treated for pneumonia if their underlying work comp injury was for a low back claim. They have to use it for Medicare covered meds associated, causally related to the underlying comp injury. And then lastly is there's what we refer to as annual attestation. And basically that's reporting to Medicare. That is the administrator or individual, if they're self-administering, going, hey, Medicare, I spent the money on a yearly basis. They have to go, I spent the money properly, so don't cut off my Medicare benefits. And here's a record of what was in the account in the beginning and what's in the end and how much I used to spend it on Medicare covered meds. Now, those 4 bullet points might seem simple, but I can tell you it's incredibly difficult for a layperson to receive a $100,000 MSA and have to abide by these requirements. A lot of them can't even do the record keeping requirements. And I always tell folks, I wouldn't have my parents. I could do this, and I would never do this myself. I would definitely go with a professional administrator. Now, we can go over to the next slide. Now, CMS indicates that an individual, unless there's issues around competency, is fine to self-administer if they want. The risk there is they're not going to be able to comply with CMS's technical requirements and obligations. And if they happen to misspend, mismanage, misreport information via the attestation process, they could risk losing their Medicare benefits. And if there's any applicants' attorneys on the phone, I would just caution you, ensure that you've educated your client with respect to this, because the first person they're going to call is you. And for our carrier self-insured TPA friends on the phone, they're probably going to call you too if they lose their Medicare benefits. So professional administration involves hiring a professional company like Amitros to administer the MSA on the individual's behalf. And you shift all that risk over an individual not being able to do this to a competent company. There's also savings opportunities. There's resources for the individual. And it's the reason why Medicare says they highly recommend professional administration. So we have the allocation, we have how you can fund it, and now we have how you can administer it, those options, and we'll keep moving on down our kind of decision tree of MSAs. Now the next question we have, we figured out how to administer it and how to fund it. Now, is the MSA going to be submitted or not submitted? And this is a question that's been going around in MSA circles for, as long as I've been doing it, for going on 18 years now. What's important to note are the foundational things here. Submission is a voluntary process. There's a contractor that Medicare has called the Workers' Compensation Review contractor, and they will voluntarily look at these cases under 2 circumstances. If the applicant happens to be a Medicare beneficiary and the total settlement amount inclusive of the MSA exceeds $25,000, or the applicant has a, quote, reasonable expectation of Medicare enrollment within 30 months of the settlement, and the total settlement amount exceeds $250,000. Now, what's reasonable expectation mean? Under CMS's guidelines, it means someone who's 62 and a half years of age or older, someone who is receiving Social Security disability but not yet entitled to Medicare, meaning they have not gotten those 24 consecutive months of payments, or someone who has applied for SSDI, has been denied, but reasonably anticipates appealing their adverse decision. So there's some subjectivity there to that last one. And again, the total settlement amount exceeds $250,000, inclusive of the MSA amount. Those are the voluntary review thresholds. and parties are free to utilize those to submit Medicare set-asides, um, assuming they're willing to abide by CMS's guidelines. Now, there's probably the last, I don't know, probably 10 years or so, there's been a movement afoot in the industry to look at non-submission as a viable option. And I'm agnostic with respect to submit or not submit. I think it's the party's discretion. It's a risk management decision. I think in certain cases it can come down to a claim by claim decision with respect to the viability of settling a claim. I certainly can see it both ways. Parties want the utmost certainty that they can put that case to bed, and sometimes they choose to submit it. Other instances, CMS can be so rigid in their policies that if that MSA was submitted, Medicare is going to come back with some crazy number so high because of a recommendation about, I'll make it up, a spinal cord stimulator that the applicant's never going to get, that totally blows up a settlement. So I see non-submission as a tool in a compliance toolbox to use when appropriate. I would take a strong guess that on balance, if everything was equal, including timeframes, and there was certainty around CMS's decisions every single time, that people would probably submit. But given CMS's inconsistencies sometimes with their review process and parties not quite knowing what they're going to get and risking a really, really high MSA that can blow up a settlement, I could see why parties choose to not submit. Now, CMS weighed in on this a couple of years ago, and I want to read you their statement. This is what they say in the Medicare Set-Aside Reference Guide at section 4.3. Medicare says, unless a proposed amount is submitted, reviewed, and approved, Medicare cannot be certain that Medicare program's interests were adequately protected, and Medicare may at its sole discretion deny payment for medical services related to the work comp injury or illness requiring attestation, remember that word again, reporting to Medicare of appropriate exhaustion equal to the total settlement amount before Medicare will resume making payment. Procedures for rebuttal. So Medicare says, unless it is shown that at the time of exhaustion of the MSA funds that both the initial funding of the MSA was sufficient and administration of the funds is appropriate, it'll require the claimant needing to demonstrate complete exhaustion of the net settlement amount rather than the CMS approved amount. So what does that mean to me? It appears that there is some procedure for rebuttal. I know of no instance where Medicare has denied benefits post-settlement because an individual has utilized a non-submit MSA and there was some sort of finding of insufficiency with respect to the funding. I have not seen that at all. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. I haven't seen it. Again, I respect and defer to the settling parties. I'm happy to weigh in on a pros versus cons risk management decision on a case-by-case basis. I think there can be benefits to both, and I think decision around whether to submit or not submit is up to the parties to do. Really, the risk for not submitting could potentially be denial of benefits, but again, I think CMS would have a very, very hard time making an argument that an MSA was somehow underfunded. So you can go to the next slide. Now, this is really the big news, and this is kind of what we've been building up to. So we've started at a really high level, and now we're drilling down here. So what's very interesting is that Section 111 is now creeping into Medicare set-aside. So every single work comp settlement involving a Medicare beneficiary has to now report MSA data, and this was as of April 4th, 2025. Now, reporting of this MSA data is required regardless of whether or not that settlement met review thresholds or not. So remember, I rattle off those review thresholds. Medicare beneficiary, total settlement amount 25 grand. If you have a Medicare beneficiary and it's settled the total settlement of $1,000, Medicare still wants to know if you did a Medicare set aside. So what has to be reported over? And it's important to note some data points are situational here. So They want to know the MSA amount, even if the MSA amount was $0. They want to know the MSA period, meaning how long is the responsibility open, effectively the life expectancy of the individual, or adjusted life expectancy. So how long is the MSA going to be there for this individual? And then they want information on funding. Was it lump sum? Was it annuity? That's why I spent some time going back and forth. And they want to know if there is a professional administrator involved or not. That's why I talked about professional administration versus self-administration. So Medicare is going to have this unprecedented 360-degree view visibility around Medicare set-asides and workers' compensation settlements that they didn't. Really, really important. And I want to drive this home. I'll say it a few times. This is only applicable to workers' compensation. This has nothing to do with liability claims. This has nothing to do with first-party no-fault claims. We're only talking comp here. And because we're talking Section 111 reporting, we are only talking Medicare beneficiaries. So let's say you have that individual who's 62.5 years of age. You're not going to be reporting MSA data on this person because you would query them and they would come up not yet entitled to Medicare. So you're not going to be reporting them. Medicare is only going to know about these Medicare beneficiaries that had settlements. And then there's going to be the associated MSA data that gets reported. Lastly, this new MSA reporting mandate via Section 111 has nothing to do with changing current voluntary submission and review thresholds set forth by CMS. So parties can choose not to submit to CMS on a Medicare beneficiary, but they're still going to have to report over Medicare set-aside data with respect to those settlements. You can go to the next slide. Why are they doing this? Short answer is oversight, visibility, and enforcement. Medicare, prior to these Section 111 reporting procedures, had no real way of knowing when MSAs were incorporated unless they went through the voluntary submission process. So is this a way for CMS to have their cake and eat it too and say, okay, submission's voluntary, you don't have to do it, but by the way, at least with all Medicare beneficiaries, we want to know about every single MSA that you did. So, maybe they're getting, more visibility and by virtue of the new procedures, potentially pushing folks who wouldn't have otherwise submitted to submit now. I'm not sure. It doesn't seem like that's happening. It doesn't. I don't get the sense that there are big upswings in submissions. I think that the recent fiscal year data that CMS provides to the industry stakeholders shows that too. It's going to, for certain, allow Medicare to effectuate coordination of benefits, meaning Medicare, if they believe that an individual is not spending or is mismanaged or misappropriated Medicare set-aside funds, it will give them the tools to identify whether or not, by correlating the Section 111 MSA data with required annual attestation submission data of, hey, this stuff's not adding up, and Medicare can and has the right to deny benefits post-settlement if they believe the individual applicant has been mismanaging or misspending their funds. It goes along with the goals of the MSP, is to prevent a cost shift over to Medicare. And it's really the only way they have, absent voluntary requests for information, which they do have, to obtain this. It just like I talked about with how if Section 111 wasn't around, Medicare wouldn't have a way to know about secondary payer situations. They were able to leverage Section 111 in a way to now know about Medicare set-asides. I also have to look at Section 4.3 in conjunction with this of the WCMSA reference guide. Is it a push to submission? Because right now all Medicare has with respect to visibility is when it's voluntarily submitted. So going forward, we're just going to have to follow trends and see what they're doing with respect to enforcement around Medicare set-asides. I think that'll be the most important thing to know. And I guess the good news is that, we haven't seen this, wholesale widespread denial of benefits in the beneficiary community, at least not yet. And keep going, please. So it does necessitate us to talk about what happens after a settlement, because I think there's a lot of mystery around. Actually, you can go back one more slide if you don't mind, to 27. I think there's a lot of mystery around what happens after the MSA gets funded and it goes to an individual. So what should occur, and I just took some snippets, I'm not going to read this wall of text, but what happens is that the administrator or the applicant is required to send in on an annual basis a summarization of what they utilized the account for in the year prior. And by the way, if the account happens to temporarily exhaust or permanently deplete, they have to report that over too, because Medicare, what they do is they take the information based upon attestation reporting, and if there are funds available in the account, they place in the beneficiary's common working file, which is a master electronic record associated with every Medicare beneficiary. Each one has one, and they place this W code for WCMSA. And if that code exists and the beneficiary treats for healthcare treatment associated with their work comp claim after the settlement, what should happen is Medicare should deny that payment. So Medicare is going to use the Section 111 data to code each beneficiary's common working file. So again, I don't have visibility into the inner workings at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but Medicare's had this technology, or rather the administrative technical capability since 2009 to do this, but now they have the data to actually effectuate it. So again, we're going to be really closely watching to see what Medicare does with respect to Medicare set-asides. You can go to 28, please. So what are some best practices I can give you here, knowing that Medicare is now going to have, total visibility of workers' compensation settlements involving Medicare beneficiaries? So what should folks do? Medicare's interests need to be considered in every work comp settlement. Now, and what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean you're doing an MSA on every case. What it means is that you're paying some sort of attention and review and analysis to each and every settlement that you have. So even settlements that are below thresholds, meaning they're below the $25,000 total settlement amount, it would behoove folks to still take a look at those cases and conduct an analysis of healthcare expenses and the pay history, and make a determination, is there going to be a cost shift over to the Medicare program, and likely conducting an MSA there. I think a reasonable, defensible MSA in non-threshold cases is a best practice that should be undertaken. And maybe it's not going to happen in every single claim where you do a full-blown MSA, but I think by and large, in many instances, you're going to find payers are going to find themselves probably doing lower dollar MSAs where they weren't going to be doing them before. I just think gone are the days when parties can just sort of, wind test an MSA and go, okay, on this, $22,000 settlement, we're going to set aside $3,000. My concern is that that's not going to hold up under any type of scrutiny with respect to the sufficiency of an allocation. Only the medical records and pay history and claim file will be able to dictate going forward what this applicant's going to need post settlement. So I would strongly encourage folks to look at their protocols and procedures they have in place with respect to claim file review and initiate something more comprehensive than you have now, if all you're doing is kind of just picking a round number. I think an independent analysis is going to go a long way against mitigating against any potential exposure that the if there is ever a contention that the MSA was somehow underfunded or insufficient. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, non-submit. So Medicare is going to have visibility into every single comp settlement that involves an MSA, whether or not it met review thresholds or not. So again, this doesn't change the voluntary nature of submission, but it does mean Medicare is going to have visibility, and at least they say they're going to be coordinating benefits, meaning they're not going to pay in certain instances after the settlement if the injured individual misspends their money. This is why I talked about the importance of professional administration. So in light of CMS's position on non-submits, I think it's important for the parties to ensure that there's some sort of defensible, reasonable, not over the top allocation that was prepared that focuses on the adequacy and sufficiency of treatment needs, reflected in the claim file records. I think it's also important and it's just the right thing to do to set the applicant up for success post-settlement. If they have resources or some sort of information packet, or you point them to a professional administrator, and ensuring that they're competent enough and that they've been educated on what the requirements are necessary to administer an MSA. And you can go on the next slide. CMS is going to begin sending out this is just a snippet of it, but it's a letter on slide 30 of what individuals are going to be getting after a settlement. So they're going to be getting contacted post-settlement when there's a TPOC event reported over. These folks are going to have some sort of education with respect to how on earth to administer this Medicare set-aside, or they're going to risk losing their Medicare benefits if they misspend their MSA funds. You can move to the next slide, please. Lastly, and I believe this is the last slide, so we're going to talk about zeros a little bit. So a zero would be if you just had a purely compromised settlement where there is a wholly controverted or disputed claim, and the individual is not being compensated for future medical expenses. It's perfectly fine typically to incorporate a $0 MSA. This is where usually no payments, medical or indemnity have been made, completely denied. Usually it's on a legal basis, and we refer to those as such as legal zeros. And there also could be a medical zero too. That usually occurs when treatment is totally ceased and a treating physician has indicated by written correspondence signed by the treating doc that, hey, this person's never going to need any Medicare covered medicals associated with their industrial injury. So legal zero, medical zero. Point being is that Medicare said come July 17th, so less than a month from now, Medicare will no longer review $0 proposals that are voluntarily submitted. So what does that mean? That means you should continue to document the file with the zero analysis, because Medicare is going to know by virtue of Section 111 reporting mandates that $0 was set aside. And Medicare has said before, I think at the most recent MSPN conference, that hey, if there's a six-figure settlement and $0 in the MSA field in Section 111, that might be a case we want to take a look at. So at least have the claim file documented with respect to the analysis that was gone through for purposes of setting $0 aside. That it should have an accompanying analysis and opinion. So with that, it looks like we're at 1 or 2 minutes maybe, or 1 minute. I don't know if there's any questions, but you can go to the last slide and certainly put my phone number, I believe, is on the last slide. And I just want to say, I know this is a dense topic, but oh, you know what? I meant to review. Don't even worry about that. We're already at the end. They'll have the materials. I just want to thank Diane.
You have time if you want to go over that. We have a minute to do it.
Sure. I mean, amended review. If you submit a Medicare set aside, you basically have two options if Medicare comes back and they want more money. There's no appeal rights like there is in conditional payments. Meaning there's no formalized, 5-step appeals process. You can go back on a re-review, basically contesting some sort of calculation error. Medicare didn't look at documentation submitted. Medicare messed up effectively. But what happens if Medicare just comes back and they say, hey, we didn't mess up. We just think that, you need to set aside another $500,000, and parties go, yeah, well, forget it. We're not settling the case. There's just too much money there. But what happens if you don't settle it and you're still paying on meds, but treatment has to change? Well, there's a procedure called amended review where Medicare effectively allows you to go back and submit a brand new submission so long as the case hasn't settled. And if the amount would be $10,000 or 10% difference from the previously approved amount, whichever's higher. And there used to be a 12-month waiting period, but as of April 7th of this past year, day one, parties can avail themselves to this process. There used to be even a cap on it for how long you could do it. Now it's pretty much open-ended. So just realize for parties out there who maybe have these old dog cases, who want to get CMS approval because there's some crazy high amount, if it hasn't settled yet and treatment has changed, you might be able to use this process to resolve some of these old settlements. So I think with that, now we're right at 6 p.m. I just want to thank Diane so much and everyone at Macro Pro. They hold the best educational sessions with a varied amount of topics and comp, but they do such a good job. And I apologize about the technical difficulty. Diane did an amazing job switching slides. It was seamlessly. So I just want to thank everyone for joining. I'll turn it back to Diane.
Well, you are welcome, and you always do a fantastic job for us, and the information that you provide to our attendees is fantastic. Nobody had a question for you, but they do have comments for you, so I'm going to share that with you. Great presentation, thank you. And somebody used exactly the same words. So people are thanking you for the information that you are providing. And so thank you, Shawn. We always love having you back. We'll probably have you back in December for our 12 CEUs of Christmas if there's any changes in what's going on with Medicare set-asides. All right, everybody, just a reminder, this is our 8th of 14 webinars for the summer school series. So if you need hours, please go to the Macro Pro website and log on. You don't have to log on, just go to the Macro Pro website and select the webinars you'd like to attend. And until the next webinar, thank you all for attending. Again, thanks, Shawn. Have a great summer.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye now.